For each is a really easy way to iterate through each item in a collection, but it has a major limitation. You can't modify the value in the iteration variable. Another way to loop through all of the items in a collection is using a for loop. For loops don't have to be used with collections. They can be used for any piece of code that you want to run several times. To begin, open the My Project sample file from your Sample Files folder. And open calculatorfunctions.cs. We're now going to create a new method, which will take a list collection containing int variables and add an int value to each item in the collection. To do this, use the following code. Public static void add two numbers, begin brackets, int amount to add, comma, list int numbers, end brackets. Now, we're going to create a for loop that will iterate through the list collection. First, store the number of items in the list collection in a variable by using the code int number of numbers equals numbers.count. This isn't strictly necessary, but it will make the next step easier to understand. To create the for loop, add the following code. For, begin brackets, int counter equals 0, semicolon, counter is less than number of numbers, semicolon, counter plus plus, end brackets, begin curly brackets, end curly brackets. This is the for loop. If you look at each part of it in turn, it is easier to understand. Int counter equals 0 creates a new int variable called counter with a value of 0. This variable will identify the current iteration in the loop. The next segment determines when the loop will end. In this case, the loop will run as long as the value of counter is less than the value of number of numbers. Finally, counter plus plus runs at the end of each iteration. This will add 1 to the value of the counter variable. You learned about plus plus in lesson 510. Any code placed between the curly brackets will now run as many times as there are items in the numbers collection. Note that, as well as the for loop, C# will also recognize the while loop. While is so similar to for that it doesn't need a lesson of its own. The difference is that for creates all of its own variables, whereas while requires you to create them separately. For example, the for loop for int counter equals 0, counter is less than 100, counter plus plus, would do exactly the same as the while loop int counter equals 0, while counter is less than 100, counter plus plus. There's no reason to use both for and while for iterating through collections. Choose one and stay with it. Most programmers prefer to use for, as it requires fewer lines of code. Next, we'll add some code to add a value to each item in the collection. To do this, add the following code inside the for loop. Numbers, begin square brackets, counter, end square brackets, equals, numbers, counter, plus, amount to add. By using the counter variable, you can access each item in the numbers collection by its index, just as you did with arrays in Lesson 8.1. Here, you're adding the value of the amount to add variable onto the value of each item in the numbers collection as you iterate through the collection. Next, we're going to try out the method on the calculator.aspx page. Open the code behind file of calculator.aspx and add a new line after the line that creates the list to total collection. Now we're going to call the new addToNumbers method using the following code. Calculator functions dot addToNumbers, begin brackets, 10, comma, list to total, end brackets. This code calls your method, which will add 10 to each of the numbers in the list to total collection. If it works correctly, you can expect the total to be 194. That's 12 plus 10, plus 17 plus 10, plus 135 plus 10. View the page in your browser and click the second button. As you can see, the number 194 is displayed, indicating that your method worked correctly. Close your web browser now. Note that all of the simple variable types, such as int, string, bool, and double, are, by default, sent to methods by value when used as arguments. Some variable types, such as list collections, are sent to methods by reference when used as arguments. The reason that the addToNumbers method was able to change the values in the list to total collection was because the collection was sent by reference. You'll learn more about sending variables by reference and by value in the Expert Skills course in this series. For the moment, all you need to know is that methods can only permanently change the values of arguments when they are passed by reference. Close Visual Studio now. You've now completed Lesson 8.4. Iterate through a collection using a for loop.